The limestone beneath her bare feet had worn smooth from 1,000 years of servitude. In the pre-dawn darkness of the pharaoh's palace, she moved through corridors where shadows pooled like spilled wine, her calloused hands carrying water that would never touch her own lips. The gold-leafed walls caught fragments of torchlight, illuminating hieroglyphs that spoke of divine kingship and eternal glory, words that meant nothing to those who scrubbed the floors beneath them. Her name had been stripped away the day the slave traders dragged her from Nubia, replaced by a number carved into the wooden tag that hung around her neck like a millstone. The scent of frankincense drifted from the royal quarters, mingling with the sharper smell of fear that clung to her skin. Tonight, like every night for the past 3 years, she would wait in the shadows of the pharaoh's bedchamber, knowing that her body belonged not to the gods, not to herself, but to whoever held the reed that marked her as property. The water in her clay vessel trembled as footsteps echoed down the corridor, heavy, deliberate, inevitable. She had learned not to pray to gods who had forsaken her, but still her lips moved in silent supplication to ancestors whose bones lay beneath foreign sand. The footsteps stopped. A hand reached for the bronze door handle. In the space of that breath, between the click of metal and the creak of hinges, lay the story of thousands who lived and died without names, without voices, without choice. The Nile rose and fell with the precision of divine clockwork, and with each flood came the renewal of a civilization built upon the backs of the nameless. In the shadow of the great pyramids of Giza, where the limestone blocks still bore the chisel marks of forgotten hands, the machinery of empire turned with relentless efficiency. The scribes recorded grain harvests and tribute payments, but their papyrus scrolls remained silent about the other commodity that flowed through Egypt's veins like blood through a body: human flesh. The slave markets of Memphis sprawled along the river's edge, where merchant ships arrived with their cargo of conquered peoples, Nubians with skin dark as ebony, Libyans with sun-bleached hair, Asiatics from the northern territories, all reduced to merchandise beneath the calculating gaze of buyers who measured worth in muscle, youth, and the capacity to endure. The women stood in separate pens, their bodies examined like livestock, fingers probing for signs of disease or defect. A virgin commanded higher prices. A mother with milk-heavy breasts served different purposes. The old were discarded like broken pottery. Within the palace walls of Thebes, where Amenhotep III held court in halls that stretched toward heaven, a different world existed, one where power flowed through bloodlines and divine mandate, where gold leaf covered every surface, and the air hung thick with myrrh. Here, in chambers decorated with images of falcon-headed Horus and cow-eared Hathor, the concept of ownership extended beyond cattle and land to encompass human souls. The pharaoh himself, living God upon earth, possessed thousands of servants, whose lives he could command with less thought than he gave to choosing his morning meal. The palace hierarchy descended like the levels of a tomb, each layer more compressed than the last. At the apex sat the royal family, draped in linen finer than spider's silk, their arms weighted with gold that could feed a village for years. Below them moved the nobles, governors and high priests, who commanded provinces and temples, their own households miniature kingdoms, where they ruled with absolute authority. The scribes occupied their middle realm, their reed pens the instruments that recorded transactions in human chattel, with the same meticulous care they devoted to cataloguing grain stores. But it was in the deepest levels of this hierarchy that the true foundation of Egyptian civilization revealed itself. In the kitchens where bread was kneaded before dawn, in the workshops where precious metals were hammered into ornaments for the dead, in the gardens where lotus blossoms were tended for royal banquets, here moved the slaves, as essential to the empire's function as the Nile itself, and just as taken for granted. The female slaves occupied a particular stratum of this underworld, their bodies serving purposes that extended far beyond their labor. In the royal households, they were sorted according to an unspoken taxonomy of use. The young and beautiful were reserved for the bedchambers of nobles, their nights measured in bruises that would heal before the next summons. Those past their prime were relegated to the kitchens and textile workshops, their fingers growing gnarled around grinding stones and spinning wheels. The pregnant were watched with the cold calculation of livestock breeders, their children destined for the same chains that bound their mothers. In the temple complexes of Karnak, where priests performed daily rituals to maintain cosmic order, slave women swept the floors where pharaohs knelt before golden statues of gods. The irony lay thick as incense smoke. These women, considered impure by virtue of their bondage, maintained the sacred spaces where purity was paramount. They washed the feet of priests who would not deign to speak their names, scrubbed altars where offerings were made for the prosperity of a kingdom built upon their suffering. The workshops of royal artisans hummed with activity, producing the magnificent objects that would accompany pharaohs into eternity. Here, slave women ground pigments from precious minerals, their lungs slowly filling with gold dust and malachite powder that would eventually kill them. They wove linen so fine it was transparent, their eyes straining in dim light until blindness claimed them before their 30th year. The treasures of Tutankhamun's tomb, the golden funeral mask that would cover tall, inspire awe millennia later, bore the invisible imprint of countless hands that never knew freedom. The domestic arrangements of noble households followed patterns as rigid as religious ritual. Slave women served not only their masters, but their masters' wives, daughters, and concubines, navigating hierarchies of jealousy and spite that could prove more dangerous than any battlefield. A misplaced word, a glance held too long, a perceived slight could result in beatings that left permanent marks or reassignment to duties that meant certain death. In the royal nurseries, slave women served as wet nurses to the children of pharaohs, their own infants sold away or left to starve so that royal bloodlines might thrive. They sang lullabies in languages their charges would never learn, their voices carrying melodies from homelands they would never see again. The future pharaohs of Egypt took their first nourishment from women who would never know the names of their own children. The legal framework that governed these lives was codified in laws as permanent as hieroglyphic inscriptions. The Code of Hammurabi, influential throughout the ancient Near East, treated slaves as property with monetary value, their deaths requiring compensation to owners but no justice for the victims themselves. Egyptian law followed similar principles. A slave's assault on a free person brought death, but a free person's murder of a slave incurred only financial penalty. The religious justification for such a system permeated Egyptian cosmology like floodwater through fertile soil. The gods themselves were served by celestial slaves, their divine palaces maintaining the same hierarchies that structured earthly life. Mart, the goddess of truth and justice, was depicted with scales that weighed hearts against feathers, but those scales never measured the worth of slave women's suffering against their master's pleasure. The sacred papyrus scrolls spoke of divine order, but they remained silent about the rituals that unfolded in the hidden chambers beneath temple foundations. Here, where the stone walls wept moisture and oil lamps flickered against darkness older than memory, the true machinery of Egyptian civilization revealed its most brutal gears. The priests of Ptah, their heads shaven and bodies purified with sacred oils, presided over ceremonies that would have horrified the very gods they claimed to serve. In the subterranean vaults of Memphis, slave women were brought for purposes that transcended mere labor. The ritual of divine testing required virgins to be examined not by physicians, but by priests whose hands explored bodies in the name of ensuring purity for sacred service. These examinations took place on stone slabs carved with protective hieroglyphs, the irony lost on men who defiled what they claimed to sanctify. The women who survived these sessions, for not all did, emerged broken in ways that had no words, their eyes carrying shadows that would never lift. The practice extended beyond temple walls into the domestic sphere, where household gods demanded their own tributes. Noble families maintained private shrines where slave women served as living offerings, their bodies considered vessels through which divine favour might flow to their owners. The wife of a provincial governor might send her most beautiful slave to spend nights in the shrine of Bes, the dwarf god of protection, claiming divine mandate for what was essentially sanctified rape. Within the royal harem itself, a complex ecosystem of cruelty flourished under the guise of tradition. The pharaoh's wives, bound by protocols that prevented them from directly harming one another, channeled their frustrations and rivalries through the slave women who served them. A queen might order a slave stripped and beaten, not for any transgression, but simply to demonstrate power to a rival consort. The slave screens became a language of palace politics, each cry a word and conversations conducted through suffering. The practice of sacred prostitution reached its most elaborate form in the temples of Hathor, where slave women were designated as gods' wives, and forced to serve as priests and wealthy donors in chambers decorated with images of divine love. The gold that exchanged hands in these transactions funded temple construction and priestly luxuries, while the women themselves were discarded when disease or pregnancy made them unsuitable for continued service. Their bodies were thrown into pits beyond the city walls, unmarked graves for lives that had never been acknowledged. But perhaps most horrifying was the institution known as flesh tribute, the practice of noble families offering slave women as gifts to cement political alliances. These transactions were recorded in official documents, with the same clinical precision used for grain shipments or cattle trades. A marriage contract between two powerful houses might include clauses specifying the number and type of slave women to be transferred, their bodies serving as both dowry and diplomatic currency. The training of these women for their roles began in childhood, a systematic destruction of will and identity that made their eventual compliance seem natural. Young girls captured in raids or born into slavery were separated from their mothers and raised in special compounds where resistance was broken through techniques refined over centuries. They learned to anticipate their master's desires, not through instruction, but through punishment so severe that survival itself became a form of cooperation. The compound on the outskirts of Thebes, hidden behind walls decorated with scenes of agricultural abundance, housed hundreds of girls between the ages of 8 and 16. Here, under the supervision of older slave women whose spirits had been thoroughly crushed, they learned the skills that would determine their fate. Those who showed aptitude for music or dance might earn positions in noble households, where their suffering would be cushioned by relative privilege. Others, less fortunate or less talented, faced darker destinies in the workshops and brothels that served the empire's appetite for disposable flesh. The process of selection for royal service involved ceremonies that mocked the sacred rituals performed for legitimate royal brides. Slave girls were bathed in scented oils, their hair braided with flowers, their bodies painted with henna in patterns that mimicked those worn by queens. But these preparations led not to marriage chambers, but to rooms where their value would be assessed by men who viewed them as instruments of pleasure, their beauty a commodity to be consumed until nothing remained but empty shells. The documentation of these practices existed not in official records, but in private letters and household accounts that survived in scattered fragments. A papyrus found in a nobleman's tomb contained detailed instructions for the proper preparation of slave women for different purposes, clinical language describing techniques of psychological manipulation that would not be out of place in modern torture manuals. Another document, a merchant's inventory, listed women alongside furniture and livestock, their descriptions focusing on physical attributes and perceived durability. The complicity of Egyptian women in these horrors added layers of complexity to an already nightmarish system. Queens and noble wives, themselves trapped within patriarchal structures that limited their power, often became the most creative architects of suffering for those beneath them. They understood intimately the vulnerabilities of female bodies and used this knowledge to design punishments that targeted not just physical endurance, but emotional and psychological resilience. The goddess Isis, protector of women and children, gazed down from temple walls upon scenes that violated every principle she supposedly embodied. Her priests collected offerings from worshippers, seeking protection for their daughters, while simultaneously blessing transactions that condemned other women's daughters to lives of unimaginable degradation. The hypocrisy was so complete, so systemically embedded, that it became invisible to those who perpetuated it. In the royal workshops, where cosmetics were prepared for divine pharaohs, slave women ground minerals with mortars and pestles that wore the skin from their palms. The coal that lined royal eyes contained lead that slowly poisoned the workers who mixed it. The perfumes that scented royal bodies required ingredients extracted through processes that filled workshop air with toxic vapours, shortening lives already measured in years rather than decades. The first crack in the foundation appeared not as revolution but as silence, the absence of voices that had once filled the workshops and kitchens with whispered songs from distant homelands. In the 21st year of Ramesses II's reign, when the great pharaoh's monument stretched from Nubia to the Levant, the slave compounds of Memphis began to empty, not through liberation, but through death. The women who had ground pigments for royal cosmetics fell victim to the lead and mercury that had accumulated in their lungs and bones, their bodies finally succumbing to years of slow poisoning. The royal physicians, those learned men who could diagnose ailments of the God King with mystical precision, found themselves baffled by the epidemic that swept through the slave quarters. Women collapsed at their grinding stones, blood streaming from their mouths as their internal organs dissolved under the weight of accumulated toxins. Others went blind, their eyes clouding white as cataracts formed from exposure to the metallic dusts they had breathed daily for decades. The most fortunate died quickly. The rest lingered in agony that no amount of poppy extract could diminish. In the palace of Thebes, where Nefertari's tomb was being carved into the Valley of the Queens with unprecedented splendor, the supply of skilled female slaves began to dwindle. The women who had woven the transparent linen for royal burial wrappings could no longer see well enough to manage their looms. Their fingers, twisted by arthritis brought on by repetitive motion and poor nutrition, could no longer maintain the tension required for threads finer than spider silk. The masters responded not with concern, but with irritation. These women had become less valuable than the materials they could no longer process. The system that had seemed as permanent as the pyramids themselves began to reveal its inherent contradictions. The very practices that had sustained the empire's luxury were consuming their human foundation faster than conquest could replenish it. The Nubian raids that had once provided steady streams of fresh slaves now encountered fiercer resistance from kingdoms that had learned to hide their populations or fight with desperate effectiveness. The cost of acquisition began to outweigh the value of what could be extracted from exhausted bodies. In the sacred precincts of Karnak, where slave women had maintained the purity of spaces they were forbidden to sanctify, their absence became a crisis of religious logistics. The temple floors, once scrubbed daily by hands that understood the weight of divine displeasure, began to accumulate the dust of neglect. The priests, accustomed to invisible service that maintained their spiritual comfort, found themselves forced to acknowledge the contradiction between their teachings and their dependence on defiled labor. The economic ripple effects spread through Egyptian society like floodwater finding its own level. Noble households that had relied on slave-produced textiles found their clothing growing coarse and poorly finished as the women who possessed the skills necessary for fine work died or became too damaged to function. The cosmetics that had adorned royal faces began to appear
in cruder formulations as the knowledge held by poisoned workshop slaves died with them, their expertise disappearing into unmarked graves beyond city walls. But perhaps the most devastating consequence was the demographic collapse that no scribe dared record in official chronicles. The practice of separating slave mothers from their children, of working pregnant women until they miscarried or died in labor, had created a population that could not sustain itself through natural reproduction. The slave compounds that had once housed hundreds now echoed with the footsteps of dozens, their emptiness a testament to the mathematical impossibility of a system that consumed human lives faster than biology could replace them. The children born to slave women in the final decades of the New Kingdom emerged stunted and weak, their bodies bearing the accumulated damage of generations of malnutrition and abuse. Those who survived to adolescence often proved unable to perform the labor that had killed their mothers, their malformed limbs and damaged organs making them worthless even as property. The empire that had built its glory on human suffering found itself facing the prospect of magnificent monuments tended by no one, empty palaces echoing with the ghosts of servants who would never be replaced. In the royal necropolis, where pharaohs lay, surrounded by treasures meant to sustain them through eternity, the tombs themselves bore witness to this collapse. The later burials of the New Kingdom showed declining craftsmanship, their wall paintings rougher, their golden objects less refined than those produced in earlier centuries when skilled slave labor was abundant. The very immortality that pharaohs sought through their burial treasures was compromised by the mortality of those who created it. The medical papyri of the period, those that survived the deliberate destruction of later dynasties embarrassed by their predecessors' excesses, recorded symptoms that had no names but spoke of suffering beyond imagination. Physicians described conditions that could only result from systematic abuse, broken bones that had healed crooked from beatings, internal injuries consistent with sexual violence, diseases that spread through overcrowded quarters where human beings were housed like animals. The psychological devastation proved even more enduring than the physical damage. The women who survived the collapse of the system carried trauma that manifested in ways Egyptian medicine could not comprehend. They spoke to invisible tormentors, their minds having retreated to spaces where memory could not reach. Others fell into catatonic states, their bodies present, but their spirits fled to realms beyond the reach of earthly pain. The few who found voices to speak of their experiences used words that had no equivalent in the language of their captors, concepts of violation and degradation for which Egyptian vocabulary had no terms. As the empire entered its period of decline, the temples that had sanctified these practices
began to distance themselves from their own history. Priests ordered the destruction of records that detailed the ritual abuse of slave women, claiming that such documents were corrupting influences that offended divine purity. The papyri that contained instructions for the proper preparation of female slaves were burned in sacred fires, their smoke rising to gods who had supposedly blessed the practices they described. The noble families who had participated in the flesh trade found themselves struggling with the moral implications of their ancestors' behaviour, as foreign conquests brought new ethical frameworks into Egypt. The Nubian pharaohs who eventually ruled from Thebes brought with them different concepts of human dignity that made the previous system appear barbaric, even to those who had benefited from it. In the tomb of Khemwazet, son of Ramesses II, archaeologists discovered a chamber that should not have existed. Behind a false wall, sealed with plaster that bore the thumbprints of ancient hands, lay a collection of artifacts that defied every understanding of Egyptian mortuary practice. Clay tablets covered in cuneiform script, not Egyptian hieroglyphs, contained what appeared to be testimonies written in languages from across the ancient world. Akkadian, Hebrew, Nubian dialects lost to time, all scratched into soft clay by fingers that trembled with urgency. The translation work began in 1923 and continues still. Each tablet reveals fragments of accounts that read like testimony from a tribunal that never convened. Evidence gathered for a judgment that never came. The women who created these records somehow found clay, somehow learned to write in scripts their captors had never taught them, somehow preserved their words in a language their tormentors could not read. How they accomplished this feat of resistance, how slaves without access to scribal training acquired literacy in multiple ancient languages, remains a mystery that challenges every assumption about education and opportunity in the ancient world. One tablet, inscribed in primitive Hebrew characters, begins with words that scholars have translated as, "For those who will come after, who will dig in the ground where we died, know that we were more than what they made us." The text that follows describes techniques of psychological endurance that seem impossibly sophisticated for women supposedly broken by systematic abuse. They reference concepts of mental dissociation, of constructing internal sanctuaries where the mind could retreat. That would not be formally documented in medical literature for another 3 millennia, but the most disturbing discovery came in 1987 when ground-penetrating radar revealed the existence of chambers beneath chambers in the necropolis. These spaces, carved into bedrock below the official burial sites, contained evidence of what can only be described as an organized resistance network. The skeletal remains found there bore marks of ritual scarification that matched no known Egyptian practice, patterns that appeared to be a form of identification, perhaps a way for enslaved women to recognize others who shared their secret knowledge. The carbon dating placed these burials precisely during the period when official records claimed female slave populations were declining due to disease and overwork. Yet these women had somehow organized themselves into a structured group, had developed their own burial rites, had created a parallel culture that existed entirely in the shadows of their oppression. They had access to metals for scarification tools, to pigments for body painting visible on preserved skin, to knowledge of preservation techniques that kept their testimonies intact for over 3,000 years. The cipher found carved into the wall of the deepest chamber has never been decoded. The symbols bear no resemblance to any known ancient script, yet their organization suggests complex linguistic principles. Computer analysis indicates mathematical relationships between the symbols that imply a level of intellectual sophistication that contradicts every assumption about the mental capacity of traumatized slaves. These women, dismissed as barely human by their captors, had apparently developed their own written language, while simultaneously maintaining their assigned roles in Egyptian society. Archaeological evidence suggests this network extended far beyond Memphis and Thebes. Similar scarification patterns have been identified on skeletal remains from burial sites across Egypt, Syria, and Nubia, locations separated by thousands of miles of desert and hostile territory. How information travelled between these groups, how they maintained communication across such vast distances while remaining invisible to the extensive Egyptian intelligence networks that monitored slave populations, defies rational explanation. The final tablet, discovered in 2003, contains text that has shaken the foundations of Egyptology. Written in what appears to be an early form of demotic script, a simplified Egyptian writing system that supposedly was not developed until centuries later, it describes in clinical detail
the weaknesses of Egyptian society that would eventually lead to its collapse. The anonymous author demonstrates knowledge of economic principles, military logistics, and political theory that rival the insights of modern historians. She predicts the exact sequence of events that would bring down the New Kingdom with accuracy that seems impossible for someone supposedly denied all education and access to information. The text concludes with a statement that has haunted scholars for decades. "We have seen the end from the beginning, for we are the foundation they built upon, and we know where the cracks will spread." Carbon dating confirms this tablet was inscribed during the height of Egyptian power, centuries before the decline.
It describes. The implications challenge fundamental assumptions about the relationship between oppressor and oppressed, suggesting that those deemed powerless possessed insights unavailable to their masters. Modern DNA analysis of the preserved remains has revealed genetic markers from populations across Africa, Asia, and the Mediterranean, evidence that these women came from civilizations possessing astronomical knowledge, mathematical concepts, and philosophical traditions that Egyptian scholars would not develop for generations. They brought with them intellectual heritage that their captors never suspected existed, knowledge that they somehow preserved and transmitted despite conditions designed to destroy human dignity and memory. The question that emerges from these discoveries reverberates through every study of ancient civilizations. What other voices remain buried beneath the official narratives of empire? How many testimonies lie waiting in sealed chambers? How many forms of resistance operated beyond the perception of those who claimed absolute power? The women who suffered in Egyptian slavery found ways to speak across millennia, their words challenging the very concept of historical truth as recorded by the victorious. In the end, the greatest horror may not have been their suffering, but the possibility that their masters never understood what they had destroyed. The civilization that built monuments to its own eternal glory may have been sustained by minds more sophisticated than those that ruled it, spirits more enduring than the pharaohs who claimed divinity. The evidence suggests that in their effort to reduce human beings to property, the ancient Egyptians may have unknowingly enslaved the very consciousness that could have elevated their civilization to heights they never imagined. The tablets remain only partially translated. The cipher resists all attempts at decoding. The resistance network's full extent remains hidden beneath sand and time. Their final secret, the knowledge that allowed them to preserve their testimony while appearing completely subjugated, died with the last woman who carried it. In the silence that follows their whispered testimony, we are left with the most unsettling question of all. What truths about human resilience and intelligence remain buried in the foundations of every empire that claimed to have broken the human spirit?